very hard not to just be totally enamored
Okay,
with the
I think it's
shipwreck
recording.
details.
Hopefully we're recording. So I try not to hang out too much in that part, but it was very hard to stop myself. So if I totally just left big things out that you were wondering about, you will just have to tell us and come next time. Okay, so we are picking up where we left off at the end of chapter 26 with Paul defending himself in front of King Agrippa, and now we're coming to the aftermath of that trial, which is that he is being transported to Rome to appeal to Caesar, which is what he requested. And he has to go there by sea. And so the majority of this kind of theme for these two chapters has to deal with being at sea in this very dramatic shipwreck, which led, I was going to say me, but that would be a lie. It led Val to text me that there's a lot of water theme in these chapters, which is, I mean, if you study the biblical theme of water through the Bible, the water is mentioned in the Bible more than almost anything else. It's so interesting. But there are three main things that water does. It initiates physical and spiritual life. John 3:5 says that Christians must be born of water and the Spirit, and he's talking about physical and mostly spiritual birth and the sacrament of baptism. Water provides physical and spiritual cleansing. In Ephesians 5:26, Paul says that husbands in a godly marriage should cleanse their wives by the washing of water with the word. And then water also sustains spiritual and physical life. So we see this. There are almost too many examples to list, but a couple quickly is when Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at the well. She's drawing water to nourish her physical body, and Jesus tells her that the water I give will become a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And then he refers to himself, and others refer to him as the living water. So water initiates life, provides cleansing, and sustains life. So the prisoner Paul sets out on the water, out to sea. The authorities are kind enough to let some friends travel with him. This would not have been the case for most people, including Luke, who we know is with him because he keeps saying, we did this, we did that. And one of the commentaries I read said that Luke, a lot of Bible scholars believe that Luke was probably Paul's personal physician at this point, which probably tells us something about Paul's physical condition, that it was at least deteriorated enough that the Roman authorities felt that he should be able to have his physician traveling with him. So Dr. Luke is keeping something of kind of a sailor's log, which is one of the most complete historical accounts of sailing practices in the first century that we have. So thank you, Dr. Luke. It's a huge ship. It has sails and anchors, which wasn't always the case, and there are nearly 300 people aboard. Probably was a cargo ship carrying wheat from Egypt, which is where the Roman Empire got their imported grains from. And at this point, it is approximately 59 AD, so roughly 30 years after Jesus rose from the dead. And it is autumn. It is after the fast, which is the Jewish Day of Atonement, which probably occurred sometime in mid-October. So late in the year, and the trip is taking longer than it normally would because they have already hit some rough winds and have had to reroute along the way. And around this time of year, all the fishing expeditions would have stopped because it was well known that the seas were rough in the winter. let's see. So Paul kind of tells everybody upon the ship, Star Wars style. He goes, I have a bad feeling about this. I don't know if that will land, but I feel like I need to explain that every Star Wars film, somebody says, I have a bad feeling about this. Paul has a bad feeling. He knows that if they continue on, they're probably going to lose some supplies and possibly some people. There's no evidence that this is any kind of like spiritual special revelation that Paul has. It's a practical thing. Paul's got a good head on his shoulders. He's probably speaking from experience. Let's see. But the captain and crew don't want to spend the winter in this tiny town where they are. There's probably not a lot of supplies there, and they've got grain that they have to get back to the empire. So they're putting these kind of practicalities ahead of the safety of everybody on board the ship, which doesn't turn out super well for them. So they're not listening to Paul, and sure enough, they hit a storm. I don't know if you've ever seen videos of like ships in storms, but you almost can't even watch it. It's got to be terrifying. So on day 2 of this, they start throwing their cargo overboard, which probably includes some of their wheat. On day 3 of the storm, they start throwing their tools and maybe even parts of their ship away. And finally, they lower their sails, which is just, that's the closest thing to saying, I give up, whatever will be, will be. So this is a desperate, hopeless situation. It's really bad. So it was at this point in my kind of critical read through where I thought, why does Paul experience all of this difficulty if it was God's will for him to go to Rome the whole time? Why is, God could have silenced that storm, but he didn't. Why? And, as people too, why is it when we are doing God's will, we can sometimes face tremendous difficulty? Paul, this is not the only account of somebody going on God's path with great difficulty. The prophet Jeremiah is also at sea in Lamentations 3:54. He says, water flooded over my head, and I thought, I'm going to die. So I just thought that's probably exactly where Paul is right now, and he probably knows that passage. So really strong parallels between Paul and lots of different Old Testament prophets. See, and if you explore this biblical theme of water, it does not take you very long to find that water comes up in times of trouble. Water can be life-giving and life-sustaining, and water can be life-threatening. In Psalm 32, David talks about how confessing sin can result in forgiveness. He says that a faithful man or person should pray to God immediately. Then the psalm goes, when great flood waters come, they will not reach him. And then he says to God, you are my hiding place. You protect me from trouble. And so as the passage goes on, we see that as God was David's hiding place when the flood waters came, so he is going to be Paul's protector. So during the storm out at sea on Paul's journey to Rome, Luke says, neither sun nor stars appeared for many a day. And on first read, I thought, gosh, that just tells us how bad the storm was because of the clouds. But if you think about it, first century navigators did not have any sort of navigation tools. They didn't even have a compass. So how do they know where they are going? By looking at the position of the sun and the stars in the sky. They don't have that. So they are listless, rudderless, directionless. They are just out at sea. And Luke's account here suggests that there is effectively no hope for them. So in this kind of hopeless situation, I want to read another psalm that Paul would have been familiar with. It's Psalm 107. This is just 23 through 32. It says, "Some go down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed." So Paul knows that God commands the wind and the waves. He knows that God can make this storm stop, but mostly he knows that God can sustain him. And God has told him that through the scripture, through David's psalm, and he's also about to tell him directly. So at one point, Paul stands up and he has some encouragement for the people on the ship, which, side note, I think that at a certain point of complete hopelessness, this has just got to sound ridiculous, right? Like if you're sure you're going to die and there's no hope and somebody stands up and just starts being like, "Hey, this is going to be fine," you have to be like, come on. But the Greek word in this passage means he stood forth. I think in the ESV it maybe says he stood up. The Greek word means he stood forth, which implies that he is actually standing out among the crowd, maybe with a different perspective. And he basically says, "I wish you all would have listened to my advice, but maybe now you'll listen to me, especially since this next bit of advice is actually from an angel. And the angel said that nobody is going to die and that we are going to lose the boat, but everybody's going to live." And this is encouraging for them. I was reflecting kind of on my initial thought, thinking that is ridiculous, and kind of being a little convicted that in my worst moments, I think I feel like somebody just kind of drifting. Like, honestly, if I was a person on that ship, I would have been like, well, we're going to die this way, and that's how it is. But the scriptures don't portray followers of Jesus like that. God is intimately involved with every aspect of our lives, and he has control over them. And even as, like, the scriptures never tell us that Paul wasn't scared. I have to imagine that he was. But even as he's going through this, he does not let go of this kind of hold to God and the scriptures and prayer. So, I don't know. I have a little journal where I write reactions, and I wrote, "Remember the one who controls the stormy wind and the one who delivers us." So maybe it's not always God stopping the storm, but God does deliver his followers one way or another. So Paul was in the same danger as all the other men on board, but God strengthened him with this encouragement. And in turn, Paul strengthened the rest of the passengers on board with this encouragement. So maybe God doesn't send followers anymore, but we have his words in our hands all the time, which is something that the passengers on the ship, including Paul, could not have imagined. So when we're in the Word, we can have the same kind of encouragement that Paul had. And I like that it shows that that encouragement can encourage others when we share it. All right, back to the shipwreck. So after 2 weeks of storms, they are finally approaching land. And the problem with this is that the waves are like violently crashing upon the rocks. So there is not a safe way for them to get there. So they're making preparations for how they're going to get on shore, but Paul tells them, stay in the boat, which sounds counterintuitive, but the last time they didn't listen to him, it went really poorly. So this time they're like, okay, we'll stay in the boat. The next day, they basically shipwreck into what we now know as the island of Malta, which is just south of Sicily. today the place is called St. Paul's Bay. Thought that was fun. This is another interesting tidbit I found. So in the late 1960s, some divers off this coast of St. Paul's Bay found anchors that date back to 1st century Rome. So we'll never know if they were those anchors, but very cool, right? They fit with Luke's description. So if they weren't those anchors, they were in the same style. Anyway, the soldiers on the ship are planning now to kill the prisoners because the militant government of Rome is not going to take it very well if you allow your prisoners to escape. That's going to go really bad for you. So they figure instead of letting them escape on this island that we've all just shipwrecked onto, we should probably just kill them. But God promised that no one was going to die, and he keeps this promise. Paul has this guard named Julius who, for whatever reason, takes a liking to him, and he shows him compassion, and as a result, everybody survived. So verse 44, which kind of rounds out the shipwreck passage, is almost like a sigh of relief. It says, "And so it was that all escaped to land." And as it turns out, the people of Malta are really nice too, which isn't what I would expect as a 1st century villager, islander, that like a ship full of prisoners just crashed upon my shore. But they make sure everybody's taken care of, and there are a lot of parallels here, I thought, back to the earlier part of Acts where the early church is taking care of each other. We know at this point the islanders are not following Jesus, but they are showing this sort of hospitality. So Paul makes a fire, and it draws out a viper, which attaches to his hand. So as Bible readers, we probably think of the serpent in the garden. Maybe we think of Moses. Maybe you think of Jesus calling the Pharisees and Sadducees a brood of vipers. Could probably spend a lot of time on that, like all the different implications, but I already spent a lot of time on the shipwreck, so I'm sorry. But the locals, who are probably steeped in Greek mythology, take this incident as a sign that Paul is evil and that he is probably a murderer. And they say that the Greek goddess of justice is looking for revenge on him. But Paul belongs to the one true God who allows him to shake off the snake and get back to the fire. And because he's utterly unscathed by this viper, the villagers decide that he is a god. This is not the first time Paul has been mistaken for a god. Back in Lystra, they thought that he and Barnabas were gods, and they had to immediately correct those people and keep them from burning their cows as a sacrifice, and then they tried to stone them. So I can only imagine what Paul is thinking as these people call him a god. But instead of stoning him, the people of Malta react with more hospitality, which is a mercy, I think. Paul's invited to stay with a chief official, and while he's there, he heals the man's dad, and this kind of starts a domino effect where he's just healing more and more people, which continues this theme we've seen in Acts of when healings happen, it's not because there's like unusual sickness that God is helping with. Like there's always people who are in poor health or injured, but God uses these apostles in Acts to heal people, to point them to him in a way that is like on their level. So even if, the Bible does not tell us whether these people came to faith, but Paul's here talking to them, these miracles are happening. Maybe being shipwrecked for months on Malta was not ideal for Paul, and especially for the Roman centurions. I'm kind of marveling at the effect that it probably had on these villagers. Okay, so when the worst part of the winter is past, Paul and all of the people originally on the ship set sail again. So this time they're headed to Rome. And when they arrive, they're greeted by friends, and Paul even gets a private jail cell, which would not have been typical. He has this high status, and his guard, Julius, likes him, so he's granted a lot more freedom than the average prisoner would have enjoyed. So it's about as cushy as being in Roman captivity gets. So Paul calls a meeting with the local Roman Jewish leaders and explains his situation to them, and they say, "We haven't heard anything negative about you, but we have heard bad stuff about these followers of Jesus." So they set up a day for Paul to tell them more about these Christians. And Paul talks to them all day and all night, as is his custom. And some of them believe and some of them don't. And we've seen this over and over again in Acts. People can hear the same truth and respond totally differently. That's because it does not depend on how well we make our argument or present the facts. The Spirit has to open hearts. Like, if anybody could have convinced people by their own power, it would have been Paul, right? And Paul actually points that out to them and says, this is just like what Isaiah prophesied. And he quotes Isaiah 6:9-10 to them, which outlines God's judgment on Israel. And he's telling them that God's salvation has come to the Gentiles and they need to get on board. So after attempting to share the gospel message with the Jews first and being met mostly with rejection, he moves on to share the message with the Gentiles. Is this ringing a bell? Like, that's how he rolls. He has primarily been called to minister to the Gentiles, as we saw kind of toward the middle of Acts, but he always starts with the Jews, which I just think shows us his compassion for his people. So Paul lived for 2 years as a prisoner of Rome. And actually, you can still visit the place where scholars believe that he was held, which is very cool. It's a little 2-cell dome. And it's also believed to be where Peter was held before his crucifixion. And that's kind of where Luke leaves us. And for such a strongly narrative, like such a sweeping narrative, the book of Acts ends almost like incompletely and very simply. But I think Luke did this on purpose. It is this huge story of how the church grew from a few apostles and spread all over the world. And it ends with one man sharing his faith simply. It reminds me of, now I can't remember the quote, but my husband has a t-shirt of it, and it says, "Preach the gospel, die, and be forgotten." Like, nobody's going to forget Paul because he wrote most of the Old Testament, but he was living that way. Like, yeah. So I because Luke is so calculated in his writing, I think that he did that on purpose to show us that at the end of the day, Paul is not some like gladiator hero. He is a follower of Jesus who was devoted to sharing what he knew. So, just in case you are interested and you didn't look it up, scholars think that Paul was probably released from that imprisonment for lack of evidence and went on preaching for a few years before being recaptured and probably executed by Nero, who we talked about last time was kind of crazy and known for his cruel and unusual punishments. But Luke leaves us with this message. The gospel is going to the Gentiles, that is, the whole world, just like Jesus said it would. And so Paul appears, maybe, on a first read, to be the victim of really terrible circumstances at the end of his ministry. So where was God during all this? When Paul was a prisoner on the ship, God appointed him a sympathetic guard who saved his life on at least 2 occasions. When Paul's advice was ignored the first time, God allowed the disaster that occurred as a result to get the whole ship to listen to him and allow Paul to call the shots when it was more critical. Despite all odds, after 14 days of battering from a brutal storm and loss of supplies and all the food, God spared the lives of every single person aboard the ship. Paul was utterly unharmed after being bitten by an extremely venomous snake, and God used the incident to show these island villagers his power. God allowed Paul to meet with Roman Christians who treated him well and encouraged him. God granted Paul tremendous freedom as a Roman prisoner, and that allowed him to share the gospel even further. So I think our walk is sometimes full of shipwrecks, and what this passage is showing us that it's important to remember that our trials are not unknown to God. In fact, and this part is sometimes hard for me to take in, God has allowed them and sometimes even orchestrated them. But even when we cannot see the stars and the sun, God is there guiding the boat and sustaining us through sometimes impossible circumstances. Way back in the Old Testament, in Isaiah 43:2, God said, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not flow over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The fire will not destroy you." So even when everything else goes wrong, because of God's perfect plan, it all turns out right. And that's all I have. Yay.